I'm Betty Bessler, and this is Snapshot of History. The Gilded Age was a time of great innovation and change in America. From unions to monopolies and even immigration, America was a nation of dynamic prosperity. As we delve into the North and East in this episode, pay attention to how the cities grew, labor reformed, and immigrants acclimated to American life. Let's take it back to the year 1870. Andrew Carnegie was one of the richest and most successful men in late 19th and early 20th century America. Despite the odds, he worked his way up from a laborer to the head of the nation's leading steel company. He represented the traditional from rags to riches story that all poor working families hope to achieve. He was, in all ways, the American dream. Andrew Carnegie was born in 1835 in Scotland. In 1848, when Andrew was just a boy, his family moved to the United States. He started off working in a factory for just $1.20 a week. His next job was at the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. He worked his way up to superintendent there and began making investments with his money. In 1865, he left the railroad business with enough knowledge to start his own company. He established the Carnegie Steel Company and monopolized the industry. He used a system of vertical integration that was one of a kind to buy up companies needed for each part of steel production, including shipping, raw materials, and coal for fuel. By 1889, the Carnegie Steel Company was one of the largest and most profitable businesses in the nation. In his free time, Andrew Carnegie wrote many books, including The Gospel of Wealth, Triumphant Democracy, The Empire of Business, and even an autobiography. He loved to write and encouraged others of the lower class to do as he had and make a better life for themselves. He told them that it was indeed obtainable and that the American dream was right at their fingertips, if they were willing to work for it. People who are unable to motivate themselves must be content with mediocrity, no matter how impressive their other talents. Several other notable quotes by Andrew Carnegie include, "You cannot push anyone up a ladder unless he be willing to climb a little himself. The man who acquires the ability to take full possession of his own mind may take possession of anything else to which he is justly entitled. Do your duty, and a little more in the future will take care of itself. No man will make a great leader who wants to do it all himself, or to get all the credit for doing it. Concentration is my motto. First honesty, then industry, then concentration." In 1901, Carnegie sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan of the U.S. Steel Company for $200 million. He then used this money to give to others, becoming known as a philanthropist. He even donated $5 million to the New York Public Library and founded his own university in Pittsburgh. Andrew Carnegie is the epitome of the American dream. He made it from $1.20 a week to one of the wealthiest men in America. His legacy is still seen today. Thousands of hopeful immigrants came into America hoping to have the success that Carnegie had. However, most of them were instead faced with disappointment and devastation. Meet Giuseppe. Giuseppe Zattoni was in all ways the typical American immigrant. Like Carnegie, he traveled to America with a dream of earning success, wealth, and status. Along with his pregnant wife Maria, he traveled from Rome, Italy, to Ellis Island aboard the SS Burgundia. The voyage was crowded and difficult. For 16 days, Giuseppe and Maria hardly even saw sunlight. Then, on May 17, 1882, the Zattoni family heard shouting from aboard on deck. They had arrived in New York. The American dream was theirs to obtain. Upon their arrival, they waited in line for hours to get through a line of 5,000 to 6,000 people. Few laws limiting immigration existed at this time, and the Zattoni family made it into America with little trouble at all. On the island, they saw the Statue of Liberty towering above. It almost seemed she was watching over them as they started their life in the United States. When they got to New York, once called the most modern city of the time, they could hardly believe their eyes. The city was nothing like what they had known back home. It seemed everything was constantly in motion, not stopping for anyone or anything. The streets smelled like sewage, and the buildings were tall and crowded. Giuseppe did not know if this dirty city was what he had been dreaming of, but he knew he had to get to work in order to provide for his wife and son Giorgio. In cities like New York and Chicago, who boomed in population and industrialization in the late 19th century, structures called tenements housed the majority of the nation's immigrant population. They were often many stories high and structurally unsafe, with only about 25 feet by 100 feet of living space, without adequate light and ventilation. Families lived practically on top of each other, which made the spread of disease frequent and common. Rats, cockroaches, and other animals made their way into the houses, leaving them even more filthy. Even the structures themselves seemed crowded, with only about a foot of space between buildings. Many died before even taking the first steps towards the American dream. Giuseppe feared for himself and his family, but tried to keep a positive attitude as he began his first day of work as a construction worker. For about 13.5 cents an hour to bring home, Giuseppe did the dangerous job of building skyscrapers. As the cities continued to grow, they began to expand upwards rather than out. Immigrant construction workers were placed in extremely difficult and dangerous work conditions. Many were injured on the job or even fell to their death. To the employer, it was just another immigrant. Why spend money ensuring their safety when there were thousands more pouring in by the day? In the late 1800s, so-called city bosses took control of city governments, establishing an almost dictatorship in local politics. They took advantage of the naivety of the immigrants and persuaded them to vote for a certain candidate or law. Giuseppe, like many immigrants, didn't understand the American system of government and did as he was told. On February 1st, 1888, disaster struck the Zattoni family. After about 8 months as a construction worker, Giuseppe fell off the high and narrow beam he was standing on and died. The McCarthy Building Company did not care about his death. It was not publicized or locally mourned. Maria was left alone to grieve not only the death of her husband, but the loss of income for her and her son. She knew that she would have to go on to work and provide for the family now in Giuseppe's place. Maria went to work in the garment industry. This industry was under the contractor system. This meant that manufacturers stayed out of day-to-day working life in their factories, and instead placed contractors in charge of the labor force. Manufacturers paid contractors for each finished product, money which had to be used to pay the laborers who made them. Often, the manufacturers paid unfairly low prices for the clothing in order to maximize the company's wealth. In order to make any profit, contractors increased hours and lowered wages for workers. They, too, took advantage of the naivety and desperation for work from the 19th century immigrants. Women were also paid significantly less than men, and Maria soon realized that her income was not enough to keep her and Giorgio alive. Her young son, too, would have to go to work. In June of 1895, disaster again struck the Zatonis. Fed up with the system of cheating and lies in the garment industry, Maria began protesting against the low wages she was given for her long and seemingly unending work. Her contractor, Mr. Gillis, fired her immediately. As she packed her few belongings, another woman sat down in her spot before Maria even made it out the door. Without Maria's income, the family could barely afford food and rent for the filthy tenement house they lived in. One day, Maria heard talk in their tenement about a settlement house that helped immigrant families to rise up in society. What the Zatoni family found there was a welcoming community and encouraging environment for the poorest in the city. Maria and her son learned to read, and Maria was able to become a teacher at the settlement house, giving others the gift of literacy she too had been given there. The life of an immigrant in the late 19th century was one filled with danger, tragedy, disappointment, and disaster. Although, like many immigrants, the Zatonis came to America seeking success and to better their situation, they remained poor pawns of those profiting from a cheap labor source. Almost none achieved the American dream they had come looking for. Success stories like that of Andrew Carnegie were few.
Thank you for watching this episode of Snapshot of History. I hope you learned something.